June 17th, 1998. The camcorder's red light blinks with mechanical indifference, the only witness to what may be my final testament. My withered hands adjust the frame, ensuring that whatever poor soul discovers this recording will see my face clearly. A map of 72 years' worth of lines and shadows, each etched by horrors most men mercifully never comprehend. I take a deep breath, steadying myself against the tremors that have become my constant companions. Not mere symptoms of age, but rather the physical manifestation of a consciousness perpetually straining against cosmic intrusion. Reality, I begin, the word itself now a cruel joke, or what passes for real in the decades since Pont-Saint-Esprit. It makes no sense. The boundaries between what is and what cannot be have dissolved like tissue paper in acid. I wish this burden on no one. The cancer eating through my body seems almost merciful now. A conventional end to an existence that long ago ceased to be conventional. I pause, considering the futility of this endeavor. Who would believe? Who could comprehend? Yet I continue, driven by the same desperate hope that has sustained me through decades of this waking nightmare. You may wonder why I bother recording this confession, why expose another soul to knowledge that has devoured my sanity like moths through an ancient tapestry. Because I have managed, through means I will explain, to interrupt the cycle twice now, in 1971 and again in 1991. But I am at my end now, if such a concept retains any meaning when one exists partially outside linear temporality. I lean closer to the camera, my rheumy eyes suddenly sharp with urgency. Whoever finds this videotape hidden among mundane entertainments at the rental store, if you cannot bear the weight of what I'm about to reveal, I implore you to pass this recording to someone who might. Do not dismiss me as delusional or these events as fabrication. If you have watched this far, you may already be experiencing phenomena beyond rational explanation, dreams populated by non-Euclidean architectures, moments of lost time, perhaps even glimpses of figures at the periphery of your vision that vanish when directly observed. The weight of responsibility, of cosmic guilt, presses down upon me as I continue. My voice drops to a haunted whisper that the microphone barely captures. If I could have spared you this life sentence, this conscription into a war beyond human comprehension, I would have. But time, that construct we so naively consider immutable, has never been on my side. It bends and folds according to her will, not ours. And she has marked you just as surely as she marked me in that French village all those years ago. The camera's unblinking eye captures my momentary hesitation as I drift back to that impossible shore, the crossroads where my life as Colonel James Weaver, decorated military officer, ended, and my existence as something else, something marked, truly began. As I stood upon that rain-slicked stone, attempting to orient myself in space if not in sanity, my gaze was drawn to the horizon. What I beheld there defies articulation through conventional language. Vast apertures yawned open across the boundary where sea met sky, colossal geometries that folded and unfolded themselves like obscene origami, operating according to principles that violated every physical law I had ever known. These rifts, for lack of a more precise term, would manifest with stunning suddenness, their edges pulsating with bioluminescence that corresponded to no terrestrial spectrum, before collapsing back into apparent nothingness as though reality itself were breathing through lacerated lungs. My cognitive faculties, still reeling from the discontinuity of my translocation from that subterranean chamber, could not process these phenomena. The mind, when confronted with the genuinely impossible, constructs elaborate barriers of denial. It recategorizes, it rationalizes, it simply refuses to perceive. Yet these merciful mechanisms had already been systematically dismantled by my encounter with the transformed victims of Pont-Saint-Esprit and the entity wearing Dumont's face. I saw, and in seeing, was forever changed. I paused to swallow a pill from the orange bottle beside me, not for the physical pain, but for the tremors that intensify whenever I venture too deeply into recollection. Finding no other recourse, I abandoned the relative safety of that stone platform and chose the path that led toward the dense forest rather than the volatile seascape. The decision was not born of logic or military assessment, but of the primal instinct that drives all organisms toward cover when exposed in hostile territory. Upon crossing the threshold where barren shore yielded to tangled vegetation, I encountered a phenomenon more subtly terrifying than the horizon's cosmic violations. The forest was wrapped in a silence so complete, so absolute, that it transcended mere absence of sound. The verdant canopy above me swayed in what appeared to be substantial wind, branches bending, leaves fluttering, yet produced no auditory accompaniment. The chittering insects, the rustling undergrowth, the calls of birds that should have populated such an environment, all were absent. Only the rhythmic percussion of the distant surf penetrated this unnatural silence, although by all acoustic principles, those marine sounds should have been the first to diminish upon entering the dense woodland. Having witnessed the biological impossibilities in France and confronted entities that seemed to exist partially outside our dimensional framework in that Bethesda facility, I might have expected to meet this new impossibility with battle-hardened stoicism. Yet this selective silence affected me more profoundly than the more spectacular violations of natural law I had previously endured. My aged face contorts as I struggle to articulate what follows. What I experienced then was not fear, fear being a comprehensible emotional response with evolutionary utility. No, what seized me in that soundless forest was something far more fundamental, a complete ontological dislocation, a severance from the basic assumptions that allow human consciousness to function within reality's framework. If language contained nomenclature for such a state, it would not be found in dictionaries of psychology, but in forbidden lexicons penned by madmen who glimpsed what rides beyond the veil of consensual reality. Temporal perception within that silent forest operated according to principles I cannot adequately explain. What felt like hours might have been minutes. What seemed brief interludes may have encompassed days. The position of the sun, if indeed it was our sun, remained obscured by the dense canopy, offering no celestial guidance. My military-issue watch had ceased functioning, its hands frozen at the precise moment I had first beheld Dumont's transformed visage beneath that silver hood. I possessed no reliable means to measure my passage through that nameless woodland. Only the progressive deterioration of my uniform's dampness and the growing hollowness in my stomach provided any evidence of time's continued progression. After traversing what might have been leagues or merely yards, for spatial relationships, like temporal ones, seemed to obey alternative geometries in that place, the dense vegetation abruptly terminated at the edge of a precipitous escarpment. I dropped instinctively to a prone position, the soldier's reflex for concealment manifesting even as my rational faculties struggled to process the tableau spread before me. Below stretched a circular clearing of barren earth, devoid of vegetation, as though the soil itself had been rendered sterile by some profound desecration. This natural amphitheater was inscribed with markings that, even from my elevated vantage point, provoked an instinctive revulsion. Precise geometric configurations that seemed to oscillate subtly when observed directly, as though the very act of perception caused them to shift between dimensional states. I reach for a glass of water, the camera capturing this moment of weakness. This evidence of how thoroughly the memory unmoors me even decades later. Within this clearing stood a solitary figure, a man draped in garments of such antiquated design and material that they appeared more like integumentary extensions of his flesh than conventional attire. Dark, tattered fabrics rippled around his form, seeming to absorb rather than reflect what meager light penetrated that accursed place. At 5 equidistant points surrounding him, forming a perfect pentagrammic configuration, lay what I initially assumed were bundles of cloth or primitive effigies. A pressure began to build within my cranium, not the familiar pounding of stress-induced hypertension, but something more invasive, as though some external consciousness were attempting to establish residence within the architecture of my mind. This intrusion brought with it a certainty, a compulsion. I must bear witness to what was unfolding below, not merely as passive observer, but as designated chronicler, as though my very presence had been orchestrated across vast temporal gulfs for this specific purpose. When the figure began to vocalize, the sounds that emerged bore only superficial resemblance to human speech. The phonemic structures suggested tremendous antiquity, not merely pre-modern or ancient, but primordial, as though the very roots of all human language were being excavated from geological strata of consciousness. Scholars might have classified it as some Proto-Semitic tongue, but such academic categorization would be woefully inadequate to capture its fundamental alienness. Yet it was not this linguistic abomination that truly shattered my remaining bulwarks of sanity. Rather, it was the sudden inexplicable knowledge that arrived not through deduction or recognition, but through direct insertion into my consciousness of the man's identity. With a certainty that transcended faith or conviction, I knew that I gazed upon Cain, the firstborn son of biblical Adam, the primal murderer, the original exile from human community. I lean closer to the camera, my rheumy eyes suddenly clear with the terrible lucidity that only terminal illness can grant. Not a metaphorical Cain, you understand. Not some delusional zealot adopting mythological identity to sanctify atrocity. The literal historical progenitor of fratricide, preserved across millennia not through divine punishment as scripture suggests, but through unholy covenant with something far more ancient than any biblical deity. What I witnessed was an iterative ritual, the original sacrifice replayed across time's vast canvas, the reverberations of which have shaped humanity's collective consciousness far more fundamentally than our species can comprehend. The most profound violations of natural law are those that transform not external reality, but one's internal mechanisms of perception. As Cain's utterances continued, a metamorphosis occurred within my auditory processing, a reconfiguration of neural pathways that should have been immutable. The incomprehensible syllables cascading from his lips did not simply reach my ears as sound and remain impenetrable. They underwent a translation process that bypassed conventional linguistic centers entirely. I understood him, you see, not through cognition, not through familiarity with his primordial tongue, but through a form of apprehension that operated at the level of raw sensation. The meanings emerged not as conceptual units, assembled from phonemic components, but as direct emotional and sensory impressions that bloomed within my consciousness like malignant flowers. His words, if such terrestrial terminology can be applied to those utterances, manifested as tactile sensations along my spine, as chromatic aberrations at the periphery of my vision, as metallic tastes upon my tongue, as olfactory phantoms that evoked epochs of decay. The ritual he conducted was not merely directed towards some entity beyond conventional perception. It was simultaneously creating and had already created the very conditions that enabled its own existence across temporal boundaries. I perceived with horrifying clarity that what I witnessed was not a discrete historical event, but rather a node in a vast hyperdimensional lattice of causality that extended backward to the dawn of terrestrial consciousness and forward beyond the theoretical heat-death of our universe. Such comprehension should have obliterated my sanity instantly. The human mind is evolutionarily equipped to process linear causality within extremely limited spatial and temporal parameters. To perceive even a fragment of this cosmic recursion should have resulted in immediate psychological dissolution, a complete separation from consensus reality, as the mind desperately attempts to protect itself through categorical dissociation. Why I did not perish in that moment, why my consciousness did not simply extinguish itself rather than continue to process information fundamentally incompatible with its basic operating parameters, remains perhaps the most persistent question of my tortured existence. Was I preserved by some innate resilience unique to my neurological constitution? Was I maintained as conscious witness by the same entity that had arranged my presence at this primordial scene? Or was my continued functionality evidence of a more disturbing possibility, that human consciousness is far more elastic in its capacity to accommodate cosmic horror than our species has been permitted to discover? Whatever the explanation, I endured. I remained cognizant, processing revelations that should have been intellectually and perceptually inaccessible. In retrospect, I understand this sustained awareness not as mercy, but as the cruelest possible sentence, the capacity to comprehend one's own fundamental reconfiguration as it occurs, to bear witness to the dissolution of the boundaries between self and that which should never be contained within human awareness. What transpired next defies articulation through any linguistic framework developed for human communication. As Cain's ritual reached its apotheosis, the very substance of reality began to rupture before my eyes, not metaphorically, you understand, but with the literal manifestation of spatial discontinuity. The air itself seemed to develop a seam, a suture in the epidermis of our dimension that gradually parted like necrotic tissue yielding to corruption. Through this aperture emerged something that my visual cortex interpreted as an eye, though that mundane anatomical designation profoundly fails to encompass its true nature. This was not an organ of sight in any conventional sense, but rather a nexus of awareness, a concentrated point of perception belonging to something that existed primarily in dimensions orthogonal to our own, extending an infinitesimal fragment of its consciousness into our reality like a fisherman might dangle a lure into dark waters. Its iris, if such terrestrial terminology can be applied, contained chromatic variations that should not exist within our visible spectrum, colors that I perceived not through optical reception, but through some faculty that had no prior existence within my neuroanatomy. The pupil was not merely an absence of light, but an absence of being itself, a perfect negation that seemed to consume rather than reflect the photons that encountered it. Most disturbing of all was the immediate, unequivocal certainty that this entity perceived me specifically, that across the impossible gulf separating my concealed observation point from the ritual site below, it had detected my presence with perfect precision. Not merely my physical location, understand, but the totality of my being, my history, my molecular composition, my cognitive architecture, the quantum states of particles comprising my nervous system. I was, in that moment, more thoroughly known than any human has ever been known by another. Then came the sound. To call it a shriek suggests auditory properties that existed solely within conventional acoustic parameters. This emanation operated simultaneously across multiple sensory modalities. It was sound, yes, but also chromatic disruption, dermal sensation, olfactory hallucination, gustatory assault. It bypassed the cochlear mechanisms of my ears and resonated directly within the deeper structures of my brain, activating neural pathways that should have remained dormant throughout human evolution. This was no mere communication, but a fundamental reprogramming, a commandment encoded within the very vibrations that temporarily suspended the laws of physics in that clearing. Within this impossible utterance lay the explicit articulation of a covenant established at the dawn of conscious thought, a pact sealed between primordial humanity and that which preceded and will outlast our species. I understood with perfect clarity that I had been conscripted into a lineage stretching back to the mythological foundations of civilization, bound by the same obligations that had preserved Cain through millennia of wandering. The pressure built within my skull as the sonic assault intensified, each modulation corresponding to the systematic deconstruction of another cognitive bulwark. I felt the barriers between conscious and unconscious thought dissolving, witnessed the collapse of the categorical distinctions my mind had constructed to impose order upon sensory data. As the sounds reached an impossible crescendo, I sensed something like an immense curtain being drawn across my perception, as though what I had witnessed was precisely the measure of revelation I was permitted. Neither more nor less. My consciousness receded not into oblivion, but into a carefully orchestrated absence, my last coherent thought being that I had been shown exactly what I needed to see, no more and no less. After that, what I am about to say will not make any sense, but I must relate it exactly as it occurred, without embellishment or rationalization. I leaned forward, my weathered face filling the frame. I woke up in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York, specifically in a densely wooded area near Lake Placid. I recognized the location immediately, having spent summers there as a child before the war. The transition was absolute. No intervening awareness, no sense of travel or passage. One moment I had been witnessing that primordial abomination in what I can only assume was some distant epoch or parallel reality. The next, I lay upon a bed of pine needles in a forest that represented the most mundane certainty of my American upbringing. The juxtaposition was so severe, so absolute in its cognitive dissonance, that for several minutes I simply lay there, listening to the entirely ordinary sounds of birds and insects, sounds that had been conspicuously absent in that other forest. The normality of my surroundings seemed almost obscene after what I had witnessed, like a crude parody of reality constructed specifically to mock my shattered perceptions. But something was off, I continue, my rheumy eyes narrowing as I recall the disorientation. The vegetation seemed marginally different, more mature in some areas, younger in others than I remembered from my childhood visits. As I navigated through the woodland toward civilization, I eventually emerged, near a Texaco filling station just off Route 73. It was there that reality truly fractured around me. Parked beside the pumps were automobile models I had never encountered, designs that seemed both familiar, yet subtly advanced, beyond what I had known. The station itself bore signage and price listings that sent a wave of vertigo through me. Gasoline at 27 cents per gallon. Impossible. I stood frozen, the newspaper quivering in my grasp, as a young black attendant in a Texaco uniform approached, wiping his hands on a rag. "Something else, ain't it?" he remarked with genuine enthusiasm, gesturing toward the newspaper headline. "First Catholic president. My grandmother said she'd never see the day. Makes you think maybe Dr. King is right. Maybe things really are changing. Who knows? Might even see a colored man in the White House someday." He laughed at what seemed to him an outlandish proposition, though his eyes held genuine hope. I must have presented a concerning spectacle, a man in soiled, outdated clothing staring at a newspaper as though it were written in hieroglyphics. The young man's expression shifted from conversational warmth to cautious concern. "You all right, mister?" he asked, maintaining a respectful distance that spoke volumes about the social realities of the era in which I had inexplicably arrived. "You need me to call someone for you?" I gave the kid the number I had for emergencies, for agents needing safe house. I thought, what more can go wrong? My taste for chaos and madness had been so forged that at this point, everything else was just trivial or jest at best. "Would you mind placing this call for me? Just tell whoever answers that Colonel James Weaver requires immediate assistance." Looking into that young man's concerned eyes, so ordinary, so blessedly untouched by cosmic awareness, I experienced a moment of cognitive bifurcation. One part of me, the military officer who had navigated diplomatic crises and battlefield chaos, recognized the need for prudent action, establish contact, acquire resources, gather intelligence. Another part, the part forever altered by what I had witnessed in that primordial clearing, regarded the entire situation with a detached, almost nihilistic amusement. As he moved toward the payphone at the edge of the lot, I experienced a wave of what I can only describe as perverse amusement. What could any government agency possibly do for me now? What safe house could shelter someone whose consciousness had been permanently altered to perceive beyond the veil? Whatever organization answered that call would be confronting a scenario so far outside their operational parameters that their response would be, at best, a bureaucratic pantomime, a performance of control in the face of the genuinely uncontrollable. Yet I allowed the process to unfold, watching with detached fascination as the young man dialed and spoke quietly into the receiver. His expression shifted subtly as he listened to the response. Surprise, perhaps a touch of intimidation. When he returned, his demeanor had changed entirely, a new respect or perhaps wariness evident in his posture. "Sir," he said, the informal friendliness replaced with deference. "They said a car will be here within 20 minutes. I gestured toward a metal stool beside the station's small office window. "I'll just sit right here," I told him, settling my weight onto the seat with deliberate casualness. "Get me a pack of whatever they smoke these days." He nodded and disappeared into the small convenience store, returning moments later with a pack of Marlboros, the red and white packaging somehow more vibrant than I remembered. "Filters are all the rage now," he explained hesitantly as he handed me the cigarettes and a book of matches. I examined the pack briefly, tapped out a cigarette and lit it, drawing the smoke deep into my lungs with complete indifference. After witnessing cosmic horror, lung cancer seemed a quaintly conventional concern. The nicotine provided a familiar chemical anchor to reality, perhaps the only familiar sensation in this dislocated existence. "I'll just wait for them here," I said, exhaling a plume of smoke that drifted lazily in the crisp January air. As I sat watching vehicles pass on Route 73, their designs subtly evolved from those I had known, I experienced a profound dissociation. The cigarette burned between my fingers, The cold January air bit at my exposed skin. The mundane sounds of the gas station provided an auditory backdrop of pure normalcy. Yet I inhabited these sensations as an observer rather than a participant, as though my consciousness floated slightly adjacent to physical reality, never again to be fully integrated with it.